Hearings got underway this week in Thunder Bay for the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls inquiry, and our own Jon Thompson was there. He heads up our Northwest Ontario hub, and he joins us now from our studio at Confederation College in Thunder Bay. And Jon, first of all, let me just say, we're really glad that the college strike is over so that you can be back there in your real home at Confederation College, as opposed to coming out of your dad's rec room, which I think is where we had you coming from last time. So welcome back, my friend.
It's good to be back, Steve.
Start us off by giving us, I guess, the overarching sense about what the mission of this inquiry is all about.
Well, you may remember the inquiry was a promise of the Liberal Party in the last federal election. When Justin Trudeau's government was elected with a majority mandate, it began. And there are hundreds of cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women across Canada, and it's going to consider those. Its mandate is to seek out and honor the truth in those cases, and it's going to give life to the truth as a path to healing, according to its website.
The hearings got underway earlier this week. Tell us exactly what's been happening.
Well, families came from all across northwestern Ontario, and so that's for some significant travel. To come and have their voices heard by the commission. There were couches and chairs set up in the front of a room. There were several cameras there, and a lot of ceremonial things happening to ensure that this was done properly. There were bags of tears at the edge of every row. Brown paper bags in which you could place tissues that were being burned in the sacred fire outside, and the ashes from those fires will then go on to the next place.
Jon, give us a sense about what some of the big overarching themes are that you've been hearing.
Well, there were major concerns, credible concerns, about the actions and conclusions of police services, coroner's offices, and the treatment that families received in the cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women. I think that in many of those cases, women were in lifestyles of risk, including drug and alcohol use and prostitution in some cases. But it's important, I think, to recognize, and that's one of the things that came out of it, is that that's not all these women were. And they were mothers, and they were daughters, and they were women, and the people who loved them came out to tell their stories and hope to get justice out of it.
And again, give us a sense about how this information comes forward. I mean, are there lawyers who are sort of helping evince the testimony? How many commissioners are there to hear it? That kind of thing.
There was between 1 and 2 commissioners present at any time, and there were legal experts working to fill in blanks in those stories. It was interesting and I think honoring that they gave everyone who spoke enough time to speak, as much time as they wanted to speak. It was all women in the open sessions. 70% of the people who will speak to the commission did so privately on the 3rd day, and the other 30% were the public events on Monday and Tuesday.
All right, in which case let's get down to some more detail here and have you tell us about a story that you've written for our website, tvo.org. This is about the Skunk family. First of all, before we do the particulars on this family, tell us about their First Nation in general.
Mishkegowimung First Nation, also known as Osnaburg, is about 550 kilometers north of Thunder Bay. It's about 1,000 people living on reserve. The total community is about 2,000 people. And since 1981, that community has experienced 300 deaths. So there are over 10 cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women who are from there. There were 26 people who died in house fires, and many of the remaining were dying violently. The truth is, nobody knows how many cases there are. And so it's a community where intergenerational trauma and lateral violence really has deeply impacted the fabric of the community. As a result of the colonial past that it's experienced.
Well, you mentioned multi-generational and intergenerational, so let's go through some of that now. Eva Skunk, who is she?
Eva Skunk is the matriarch of the Skunk family. She's 93 years old, and she bore 11 children in the 1950s and 60s. Those children, many of them were taken away to residential school, the 60s Scoop, and the older among the girls were taken to reform schools 2,000 kilometers away in Guelph and near Lindsay at the age of 12 or 13 years old as a result of breaking windows.
Well, let's keep going, John. How about the next generation down? Eva's grandchildren. What's happened to them?
Well, we focus a great deal on Melissa Skunk, who is the coordinator of Mishkegogumang Safe House, the women's shelter there that was constructed in 1997. And that was built to rebuild Mishkegogumang in the aftermath of the revelation of the amount of domestic violence that was happening in that community. At that time, they attempted to hold sessions regarding sexual and physical abuse. And because of the tight-knit nature of the community, they weren't able to attract anyone to come out to those sessions. Melissa has been herself exposed to drugs and alcohol. She was sexually assaulted as a child, and she had to deal with her own daughter falling into a crack addiction in Thunder Bay in that following generation. And so what we see is generation after generation spinning into the effects of trying to break from the cycle. And again, we're trying to take this to the place of showing both intergenerational trauma and what happens at the community level.
The Skunk family's story, John, sounds extraordinary. Is it?
Well, and that's the really frightening part, is that it's not. It is among a number of families who've gone through this sort of thing. Like I said, 300 people have lost their lives since 1981. And so you space that out, and you're talking about a funeral every month, in many cases prematurely, in many cases violently or lost to fire. And so what the former chief and now social service coordinator, Connie Gray McKay, tells us is that basically triggers and traumatizes the entire community every time it happens. And you have a series of only a few people, mostly women, who are carrying the weight of the entire community when that happens.
When the commissioner, Michelle Odette, heard the testimony from this family and others, how did she react?
Michelle Odette was deeply moved by the Skunk story, and it really felt like we were experiencing history as reporters in the room. She spoke for 12 straight minutes about her feelings on the way that the inquiry was set up. She had said she wished she could open up every case across Canada. She said she was concerned about the institutions. Direct quote, she said, "The system failed and is still failing. Am I going to get fired for saying that? Maybe, but I'll sleep well." And I think, and she had tears in her eyes at that point, and I think that was the moment where it really started to show that that hearing these cases over and over and over again with these themes running through them deeply impacted the people who are trying to unbiasedly hear and digest this information.
Now, after the Skunk family spoke to the inquiry, John, did they say anything that they thought in particular could be done to help at this point?
Well, Melissa, as I say, is an interesting perspective, because she operates the women's shelter in Mishkegogumang. And Connie Gray McKay spoke as well. She received the only applause, Connie did, that I heard throughout 2 days at of testimony, when she said that this is ultimately comes down to the question of broken treaties and Canada not living up to its agreements with First Nations people. And so what they're trying to do at this point, now that they've been successful through 20 years of destigmatizing violence and the normalized behaviors of sexual predatory nature and other forms of violence, they're now trying to move into counseling on a community-wide level, and they've amplified the services that are available now, because if and this is something Melissa says, if all you do is just bring it out, then it has nowhere to go. And so there's a cabin on a lake nearby that's been reinstated to be used as a sort of retreat for families. It's also being used by children as young as 10 years old who are at risk of suicide. And that's the way that they see this coming up. Connie Gray McKay also says that it needs to focus on the men because the women are mostly victims of male violence. And for the men to recapture self-actualization and understand and restate their goals and their position in families and in the community is a path forward. But you can see how just storm-like this appears as a challenge to overcome.
Well, Jon, we're grateful that you were able to watch the testimony for us and bring that story to a broader audience across the province of Ontario. Take care, my friend. We'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks so much, Steve.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.